Were they burned, or were they captured and taken back to Beijing or some other place? And this is a mystery so far. We really don't know this very well. I've been trying to find out a number of things that took place in China in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and it's very, very difficult to do that. Trying to locate this type of information is almost impossible. I'm hoping that if I keep at it long enough, eventually I'll pry something loose. But I think that the Chinese themselves were so definitely anti-religious, where they saw religion as the absolute enemy, that I don't think they had the same approach that the Nazis did. The Nazis did not see religion as the enemy. They saw Catholicism as the enemy, Christianity, Judaism as the enemy, and even Islam as the enemy. But they did not see religion per se. They believed in a kind of pagan religion that they wanted to bring back. China had nothing like that during the revolution. They wanted to suppress all religion completely. So I think they may have viewed the Nazi expedition to Tibet as pure superstition, or they may have seen it cynically as the Nazis' attempt to co-opt Tibetan religion and Tibetan practices to build another front against the British in India. I mean, there's all sorts of things that could have been going on. I think the Chinese would have taken the cynical point of view. So I don't believe that the Chinese were secretly looking for Tibetan knowledge. I think they may have poo-pooed that completely. But at the same time, what happened to those libraries? What happened to all of those scrolls? What happened to all the documents that were kept there? I mean, the lamas were able to take some of them out of Tibet when they fled into India, into Nepal. But there was a lot that had to be left behind, and I'm very curious as to what happened to that.
And if we talk about the Chinese, the communist revolution, I mean, it seems to me that it's been kind of ongoing in one way to kind of break down the previous Chinese traditions from, I don't know, from the 1910 or something like that, all the way up to after World War II, almost up to 1950. We had different wars going on back and forth and so forth. But I mean, China is an ancient empire. It's been around for a long time. How do you think it is that communism just could come in and kind of take over so easily in a way?
Well, it's an interesting point too. It's something that I've often wondered about for various reasons, especially because China itself is not really one country, and the Chinese will hate me for saying this, but there's no such thing, for instance, as the Chinese language. Let's be blunt about this. Not all the Chinese speak the same language. There's virtually no similarity between Cantonese, for instance, and Mandarin, no matter what they tell you. They can try to explain it, they can try to find a way, but believe me, if you're a Cantonese speaker, you do not understand Mandarin, and if you're a Mandarin speaker, you are lost with Cantonese or Hokkien or any of the other dialects. These are all different languages with different tonal structures. The only thing they have in common is the written word. This was the genius of Chinese calligraphy, Chinese characters, is that they were not phonetically connected. In other words, I could write a character, you could pronounce it one way, I'll pronounce it another way, but the meaning is the same. And that was the brilliance of creating this written language. It unified a country where everybody was speaking their own language, essentially, but they could communicate using the written word because the characters meant the same. I think that communism, when Mao brought it in, he essentially, as the Chinese like to say, it's Marxism, Leninism with Chinese characteristics. And I think what he was able to do was create a kind of communism that everybody could agree with, a kind of movement that, even though each individual warlord had their own interests, each individual territory had their own interests, the intellectuals were one group and the workers were another, the peasants and the factory workers, but they could all kind of agree on this because it was their identity. It protected them against the outside. And I think that's what they really wanted. They were invaded by Japan. They had Russia they were dealing with the Russian-Chinese confrontations of the late 19th, early 20th century. They had the Japanese incursions. They had Westerners there, like crazy, who were in bed with the Empress Dowager, figuratively anyway, and she was selling out the country. So the Chinese eventually, at one point, as a group, they got together and said, this is it, this is enough. They saw Chiang Kai-shek as a puppet of Western interests. They did not want the West to come back in and run their country. They had dealt with the opium wars,
Yeah.
having opium, shoved down their throats. So I think it was a kind of ethnophobia that allowed Mao and communism to take root in China. This was so radical. There were no kings, there were no queens. It was a completely unique, pure creation for China at that time. And I think they embraced it for that reason. It was going to protect them against the West, and it was going to give them pride as a country, as a unified country, regardless of their languages and their backgrounds.
Yet the philosophy of communism is Western, if we want to look at it from that point of view.
Oh, yeah.
And they allowed that philosophy in one way to kind of infiltrate them or take them over in that way, right?
Well, exactly. That's the irony of this whole thing. I mean, Karl Marx obviously was not Chinese, and he was the penultimate or the ultimate Westerner in a sense, because he was fighting against the Industrial Revolution. He was fighting against the things that were causing all this damage to take place in the West, things that had not happened yet in China. And part of my arguments with the Chinese when I was there, and I've been there a lot over the last 25 years, I've often argued with them over this fact that they could not have communism in China. It was not ready. According to Marx, you had to go through various phases. You had to go through a feudal period, you had to go through the Industrial Revolution period, a capitalist phase, et cetera, et cetera. You could not suddenly create communism overnight. And we went through this a lot of argumentation over this concept. And I told it failed in Russia for the same reason. They didn't go through an Industrial Revolution phase. They didn't go through a workers in the factory phase. They didn't go through a capitalist phase. Well, now China is going through a capitalist phase. And I just know there are party members there, the old school, the people who marched on the Long March with Mao, who are sitting back and thinking, well, we have to go through this now in order to achieve true communism. I think in the back of their minds, this is only a stepping stone towards complete socialism and communism. And I think that's what they're thinking.
Well, that is interesting, isn't it? Do you think that it could be, the ultimate socialist goal of actually having a world empire in that sense, and with the aid of the Chinese, this is how it will be done? They understood that we have to use capitalism in order to kind of destroy it, if you will. Do you think that that's what they're going for here?
Well, in a sense, I think that, I don't think they were listening to me and my arguments, but I think it's been pretty much, a lot of people have been saying this for a while, that, communism wasn't working because nobody listened to Marx. Nobody followed the historical necessity that Marx said communism was inevitable in history as long as it went through these various phases. And it's possible. I mean, George Soros recently famously declared that, China was going to be the next empire.
Yep.
You might as well just sit back and enjoy it, because that is what was going to happen. Well, imagine if that is true. Capitalism does not equal democracy. And that's something that in the West we've heard too many times, that there's some kind of equation between capitalism and democracy. Free markets means, a democratic government, a democratic form of government. Not necessarily. That's not necessarily true. And I think the Chinese look at it that way. It's a controlled economy in China. It still is. The government still controls that economy. They control the value of the yen. They control what is exported and what is imported. They have a lot of control over the system. They can step in at any time and close it down if they wanted to, which is what we don't have in the United States, as an example. So I think that in the back of their minds, they're thinking, we want to create still this idea of a worker's paradise. The problem was we were exploited for too long by the West, because they had capitalism. They had the technology that we needed. We had to get that technology. Well, guess what? Now we have it. We have pretty much everything we need from the West. We're still trying to, steal some secrets here and there, and there's still this kind of corporate industrial espionage going on and that sort of thing. But for the most part, the Chinese have a handle now on technology. I mean, they're sending ships into space. They have an active electronic infrastructure in China. So at this point, they're saying to themselves, what's the next step for China? A peaceful empire, one that can convert rather than invade. And I think the Chinese are looking forward to something like that. I think they want to gradually overtake economies, gradually overtake ways of living, ways of approaching things in different countries. Not today and not tomorrow. But perhaps in the next 30 to 50 years, you may see China